I kept looking at these texts. I kept thinking about the Garden of Eden story because it says, "On the day that you eat of it, you will surely die." And there are a lot of these texts from the sixth century archive where the temple authorities, usually one of the higher up temple officials, either says directly in the text or has the scribe include it in the text in the third person, that if the oblates fail in their duties, whatever that might be, they will be punished. After he eats the fruit and his eyes are opened, he's become too close. He's had his intellectual and maybe ontological status raised up with this new knowledge that he has. And now he's much too close to the status of divine. She says he's too defective, and I would say he's not defective enough. And I think later in the story, when Eve says, "Oh, but we're not even supposed to touch them," I think she's really telling the truth. What she says is in keeping with what I know about these temple servants from Babylonia. They're not supposed to touch sacred items.
Hey everyone, this is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today I'm on with Dr. Bruce Wells. We're going to be talking about Babylonian administration texts and how they could help us understand the Garden of Eden narrative better. How are you doing today, Dr. Wells?
Oh, I'm doing fine, thanks, Zach. Happy to be with you.
Awesome. All right. Can you give us a little bit about your background as far as writings, your teaching, school, all that kind of stuff?
Sure. I'm an associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin. I've been here for 4.5 years. I teach in the Middle Eastern Studies department here. Before that, for 13 years, I taught at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. It's a Catholic Jesuit school there, and I still root for their basketball team. Um, and prior to that, I taught for 2 years at a small Lutheran school in Minnesota. I have a PhD from Johns Hopkins. I have an MA in Old Testament Semitic languages from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. So I come from a Christian background. I am a Christian, and that was part of my motivation for going into biblical studies. I wanted to do something academic, and I was hoping to kind of connect it to something that was meaningful to me in terms of my faith, and it worked out. I discovered Old Testament studies, the academic side of Old Testament studies in seminary, and I feel very fortunate, blessed to be able to do this as a career.
Can you give us a summary of what we know about temple administration texts that could give us, a general, I guess what we're going to be talking about today?
Yeah, sure. So when people read the Garden of Eden story, a lot of times they look to other creation accounts from the ancient Near East to help set the background and context for the biblical story. And that's fine, and that's very helpful. I'm trying to bring to the discussion another data set, another collection of evidence that I think can help us understand the background of the story. And these are texts that come out of, as you said, temple administrative archives. Now, we have a lot of archives from different time periods from the ancient Near East, of course, but we have a set of very interesting archives from what we call the Neo-Babylonian period. So we're talking the 6th century or the 500s BCE. And there are three major temples there that we have archives from. For each temple, we have well over 3,000 documents. One of them reaches up over 30,000 documents. And a lot of these are basic administrative records about commodities that the temple received or shipped out. A lot of them are very boring and uninteresting. Lists of personnel and the rations they received, but a lot of them have to do with gardens and orchards that the temples owned and had to take care of. And these gardens and orchards are called the orchard of such and such god or so and so who is a goddess. So you might have the orchard of Ishtar or the garden of Shamash. And these temples would assign some of their workers to take care of the gardens. And some of these were low-level servants who had to do exactly what the temple said and relied on the temple for rations to keep themselves alive. They were low-level servants. I wouldn't call them slaves because they were able to own property and engage in side business on occasion, but they had to obey the temple completely, and the temple promised to take care of them, at least at some kind of subsistence level. And they were the main workforce for these temples. Um, there were other folks involved in the administration, higher level folks we might call priests, who didn't just get rations from the temple, but they were given a share of the temple income in return for their higher level duties that they had to perform. Um, but these temples owned vast tracts of land. They owned agricultural fields, but they owned these orchards. And the way they handled the orchards seems to me very similar to kind of how God or Yahweh in the biblical story handles the Garden of Eden. And so for the last couple of years, I've been working on this project where I've been trying to put together how these Babylonian temples from the 6th century handled their orchards and gardens, and see what parallels I can find between that system and what's recounted in Genesis 2 and 3.
Wow, that's really cool. Okay, so something that I really liked about your work was that, I mean, you're using texts that use a lot of the same language that's used in Genesis, and it's like how it's almost like they might be using the same words, which can help us understand those phrases better, and talking about dying and not eating. So I'm really excited to get into this. So can you give us just the background that is needed for like how these temples operate, specifically temple hierarchy, uh, like how the
Okay.
gardens work and how they relate to temples and how they're managed and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I'll do my best. So you have the very highest temple authorities, and there are certain terms for those officials. And then just below them, you have these priests. I use a fancy term called prebendaries, which comes from the Middle Ages, but we don't need to use that term. We can just call them priests. And some of them were responsible for preparing the meat that was offered to the gods. Some of them were responsible for brewing the beer that was offered to the gods, or mending the clothes that were put on the gods, the divine statues in the temples. And then underneath the category of priests, you had a category that I call oblates. These are these low level servants who have to do what the temple says. And some of these oblates were assigned to work in orchards, and their main job was to guard the orchard and also do the work that goes along with taking care of an orchard. Now, these terms for guarding and working are important terms. They show up not only in these texts that say, "You, Mr. Oblate, you have to go take care of this garden over here or take care of this orchard over there." They show up in letters where officials are writing back and forth to each other, and when they want to tell somebody, "Hey, you need to take care of this temple or you need to take care of this piece of land owned by the temple," they almost always say, "Make sure that you handle the guarding of this place and the work that goes along with this place." So these terms guarding and work are very important. I don't know if you want me to use the actual Babylonian words or just keep it in English.
I mean, you feel free to go ahead and say it. Yeah, I can put it on the screen.
Oh, so the word for guarding is matsartu, and then the word for doing the work is a combination of words, dula, apeshu. So dula is the word for work, and apeshu is the verb for to do. Um, and so, as part of this project I'm working on, I have decided or seen that these are parallel to what Adam is supposed to do in the garden. So, when it says that Yahweh placed the man in the garden, he did so that the man would work the garden and guard the garden. And the Hebrew word for work there is avad, and the word for guard is shamar. And these two words also show up in the book of Numbers and describe exactly what the Levites are supposed to do there, who work for the priests. So in the book of Numbers, the priests are the higher up level of temple officials. The Levites are one step down, and the Levites serve the priests. And the two things the Levites are supposed to do is guard stuff that's there. They guard the tabernacle space. They guard some of the equipment. That's shamar. And then they also do work, avad, on behalf of the priests. And then I think it's in Numbers 8, it says that when a Levite turns 50 years old, he stops doing avad, or work, but he continues to do shamar, or guarding. So it's pretty clear that these two words capture what the Levites do, and at a certain age, a Levite may not be able to perform one of those anymore, but they're still allowed to perform this guard duty where they just kind of, not just, making light of it, but they station themselves at particular positions to make sure unauthorized people don't enter sacred space, people who aren't supposed to be there. Um, so the connections I make are these. Number one, because Adam is doing the same things that the Levites are doing, we can assume he's involved in some kind of cultic activity. Something he's doing relates to temple work, cultic work on behalf of God. And then the fact that these two terms are used over and over again in these Babylonian texts for taking care of gardens and taking care of temples and taking care of sacred space in general, I think we can connect what Adam is doing with what these oblates in Babylonia are doing in terms of taking care of orchards. So my main argument is that the author of the Eden story wants his readers to understand Adam and Eve as temple oblates. So he's sending signals in the story to indicate that's the status that they have in the story. And these words for guarding and doing work are just one of the connections between Adam and the Babylonian oblates.
Wow, that's really cool. I did not know that about Numbers regarding that priests were not told to do that because that was one of my questions was regarding, typically Adam and Eve are seen as like, priests in the garden, but that I wonder, does that mean that they can't be priests in this case, or they're just like a
Mm-hmm.
different kind of priests, or how does that work?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Zach. And I'm not sure I have a very good answer for it. So I don't know if the implication is they can move up to the level of priest. Um, it gets complicated with the Levites because the priests also come from the tribe of Levi, but they're from the line of Aaron. And Numbers separates the Levites into 3 clans, and each clan has a particular responsibility when it comes to tabernacle equipment. But these 3 clans are not from the tribe of Aaron, or sorry, from the line of Aaron. Um, and so they will not be able to get promoted to the position of priest, because they're not a descendant of Aaron. So, yeah, I don't know if Adam and Eve, I guess the question is, should readers of the Garden of Eden story interpret Adam and Eve through the lens of priestly work, or should they interpret it through the lens of lower level Levite work? Um, and I want to argue that they should interpret it through the lens of lower level Levite work. It's still cultic work. It's still an activity that supports the whole enterprise of this sacred estate that we call Eden. So, just as an aside, I think what we call the Garden of Eden is part of a larger estate, because in Genesis 2, I forget what verse, 7 or 8, it says that Yahweh made a garden or planted a garden in Eden, which makes it sound as if Eden is a larger place and the Garden of Eden is just one part of this larger sacred estate. Um, so I agree with the people who say Adam and Eve are involved in cultic activity. I would just say it looks like it's the kind of cultic activity performed by temple servants who have an important role, but not necessarily by temple priests.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that's really, really interesting to think about. Thank you for answering that. Another off the cuff question. So, you talk about Abad Shamar, you talked about working and keeping, that's what the Hebrew words mean at least.
Mm-hmm.
And then you talked about, the Babylonian words for working and keeping and
Yeah.
guarding or whatever. Question though, when you talked about guarding, that's a little weird because it's, I mean, I know a lot of people that aren't even young earth creationists that think that, the garden is supposed to be like a paradise where there's like no death, no harmful bad things happening. So like in your eyes, what do you see needs guarding?
Hmm. Yeah, that's another great question. So in the Babylonian context, guarding makes more sense because there are animals around. They have to be kept out of the orchard. There may be other people who want to come by and take some of the produce. They have to be kept out of the orchard. One of the very common responsibilities for these oblates who have to take care of orchards or gardens is to build a wall around them, probably some sort of mud brick wall. It's not going to keep everyone out, but it'll be a deterrent, um, for some animals and for a lot of people. But then they also have to make sure, um, that anybody who can get over the wall also doesn't take anything they're not supposed to. This stuff in the gardens and the orchards belongs to the god or the gods there. It's sacred in that respect. And some of it will eventually find its way probably into the actual offerings that they present to the gods. So they present to the gods not just meat offerings or grain offerings. In Babylonia, they presented fruit offerings, along with the meat and the grain. There were two sets of offerings in the morning and two sets of offerings every night. And then special occasions, there were additional offerings. Um, so this is sacred produce because it's owned by well, believed to be owned by the god, but we would say owned by the temple. So this is a stalling tactic to avoid answering your question. But when it comes to Adam and Eve, um, yeah, exactly who are they guarding this fruit from? And uh, one way out of that question is to say, well, guarding or keeping is kind of a general word for protecting and seeing things grow and get produced without being damaged too much. But I would say if we want to sort of take the story at face value, I mean, I think this is a work of art. I think it's a piece of literature, but we want to try to kind of enter into the world of the story. Um, then we have to say, Adam and Eve may be guarding it from some of the animals that were created, in the story shortly before he's placed in the garden to work it and to guard it. Um, I don't know what we're supposed to imagine the animals are eating, in the world of the story, but maybe he has to protect certain trees or a lot of the trees from the animals. Um, I think John Walton, a former guest of yours, has argued that there are other people actually around outside of Eden who might want to come in and take some of the produce that doesn't belong to them. Um, I'm open to that idea. I don't know what to make of that at this point. I also want to say, maybe more directly in answer to your question, I don't think the author is trying to say that the existence of Adam and Eve in the garden is some kind of totally blissful, peaceful, relaxing time where all they do is sit around, eat some fruit every now and then, and play with the animals. Um, because of verse 15 in chapter 2, because he's placed there to work the garden and to keep it or guard it, I think he is actually doing work. And the author doesn't say what kind of work. He expects the audience to know what the combination of these two verbs means. And they should know because this is what temple servants do, as we can see from the Babylonian text. And it's what temple servants do, as we can see from the text in Numbers about the Levites' activities. So I do think they're busy. They have stuff to do. Um, the the question that I'm sort of beating around the bush on is the question of who or what they have to guard the fruit from. And I'm just sort of speculating it's the animals and maybe other people if the author wants us to imagine other people being around.
Yeah, of course, it's the text doesn't say. And as you talk about, something I do really, really like about your work is you talk about how when the text isn't like doesn't go into great detail, it might be because the audience is already supposed to know, and they would have already been familiar with that, and you still use that partly to argue for like maybe they would have known this temple administration context part of things.
Hmm.
Um, but but long story short, we don't know, and so I really appreciate the thorough response. I really like that. I appreciate that. Okay, so a big question that's going to be asked is, how exactly is this actually important if it's written in the sixth century, or around the sixth century, like in Babylon. There's not a definite, well, I guess for a lot of people, a lot of Christians at least, there's not a definite, um, we don't know 1,000% sure when the Genesis passage is written. So, just hypothetically speaking, like if we think it's written in, 1300 AD, it's going to be like this sixth century text context is it doesn't seem to be very helpful, or might
Hmm.
not be very helpful. So maybe you could respond to that, but also, do we have any other texts from this administration type of temple environment context that are outside of this sixth century
Hmm.
Babylon um, that might give other context, or like is that all we have in all of the ancient Near East?
Right. That's a fair point. It's not all that we have. We have a number of texts from the earlier period, the Neo-Assyrian period, so we're talking 7th and 8th century. And there are a couple of references to temple oblates, but we don't know nearly as much about them from that time period just because of the nature of the texts. The archives we have are just different. We have a lot of, from that time period, we have a lot of letters about um, astronomical phenomena in the skies and how to interpret that stuff. But that doesn't help us with the issue of temple oblates and orchards and temple administration. If we go back further in time, if we go way back to the Ur-3 period, around the year 2000 BC, uh, we actually have a lot of texts that relate to temple administration. They're slightly different. I don't know them as well. They don't capture the details of what the temple servants are doing in the orchards and the fields to the same degree that these Neo-Babylonian texts from the 6th century do. But as part of this project, I need to look at this older period, the Ur-3 period. We call it the Ur-3 period because it's about the city of Ur. It's when the city of Ur is prominent and ruling much of southern Mesopotamia. And I think I have this right. It's the third time that the Sumerian king list says kingship was transferred to the city of Ur. Now, maybe uh, I'm supposed to know if this is right or not. I think that's right. Anyway, um, it's around the year 2000, a little bit before to a little bit after, and so I need to take a closer look at that corpus of texts to see if there may be any connections I can latch onto there that might help us with the Garden of Eden story. I don't think there will be as many. I don't know if there will be any at all, to be honest. Now, just because the best texts for these parallels come from the 6th century doesn't necessarily mean the Garden of Eden story was written in the 6th century. It might have been. But if it was written earlier, what my argument would be this: the 6th century texts tell us how temples operated and how they handled their servants and how they managed their gardens and orchards. And we get a very excellent window into that material in the 6th century. But we can assume the temples of the ancient Near East generally practiced the same kind of administrative techniques and had the same kind of administrative system in place at other time periods and earlier time periods. So even though we don't have the same kind of archival texts from these earlier periods, we can assume that what was happening in the 6th century was pretty much what was happening in the 7th or the 8th century or even earlier. Um, and so I think the parallels are still helpful uh, in terms of reconstructing the kind of knowledge that the early audience would have brought to the story. But pinpointing an exact time period when the story might have been written is very difficult, and I'm hesitant to say when it was written because it's just really impossible to say.
Yeah, right. Yeah. No, that's a really good point. And we do see a lot of similarities between, the tabernacle and Solomon's temple that relate to other temples in the ancient Near East, which I've talked about on my channel before. So yeah, that would make sense that they would have a lot of similarities, although it's difficult to prove. Could you talk about the temple texts of that period that seem to match up with the Genesis narrative?
Mhm. Right. So I've talked a little bit about texts where oblates are assigned to work in orchards and to guard and keep them, just like, or sorry, work and guard them, just like Adam is. We have other texts where oblates are assigned certain duties, sometimes in orchards, sometimes related to things that have nothing to do with orchards. And then at the end of the text, it'll say, on the day when such and such happens, you will be punished in a certain manner. So this, the whole reason I started looking at these texts basically had to do with that phraseology right there, on the day when something happens. And I really wasn't interested in the connections to the Garden of Eden story at that point. There were other issues on my mind, and as I kept looking at these texts, I kept thinking about the Garden of Eden story because it says, "On the day that you eat of it, you will surely die." And there are a lot of these texts from the sixth century archives where the temple authorities, usually one of the higher up temple officials, either says directly in the text or has the scribe include it in the text in the third person that if the oblates fail in their duties, whatever that might be, they will be punished. Now, the punishment sometimes is a fine, sometimes it's stated more generally in the sense that they will have to answer to the royal administration, which oversees the temples ultimately. Sometimes it's you will have to go work in a different field. Um, Sometimes, I guess, probably the most common one is you'll have to answer to the royal administration, and they're not going to treat you as nicely as we might, the temple administration. Um, Now, in Genesis, it says, on the day you eat of it, you will die. So, of course, I wanted to find a text that says, on the day you don't fulfill your administrative duties, you will die. um, and there aren't any that say it quite like that. There are a couple of texts that refer to death. Um, One is where word is going out from one of these high temple officials to oblates who work in agricultural fields. So they're not working in orchards, they're working in grain fields where they grow barley mostly. And the order is you can't rent out part of the grain field you're responsible for to a sharecropper. So somebody who's not part of the temple personnel, but who might want to rent part of a field. The guy says, you bunch of oblates, you can't do this. You're not authorized to do this. Um, and we, the temple, will lose money if you do this. So don't think you can rent out part of your field to a sharecropper. And he says, if you do, he doesn't say on the day that you do, he just says, if you do, you will be put to death. Now, to my mind, based on what I know about how these temples operated, the death threat doesn't seem terribly likely. I mean, it's a little scary, but I don't think they would have put these guys to death. Number one, because it wouldn't have been a huge deal if they actually rented out part of their field to a sharecropper. The temple would have gotten involved, ended that deal with the sharecropper, and made sure that it didn't happen again in that field, and assigned somebody else to watch over the field. But secondly, the temple was constantly short of manpower. All these temples were the economy was growing so fast, and the temple had so much land on its hands and so much economic activity going on that they couldn't keep up with everything they had to do. Um, and temple oblates didn't have a great life because they were under the thumb of the temple, and they often ran away. So we have, any number of texts talk about runaway oblates. Um, so I don't think the temple wanted to reduce its workforce by killing off some of its oblates, but this threat of death puts the oblates in a very scary position, and it means we are taking this very, very seriously. You'd better not do this, or you're going to be in big trouble. Um, but we have, as I said before, we have a lot of these texts that say on the day, but other texts will just say if, like the one I just talked about. And these are what I call conditional verdicts. They say if a certain condition is fulfilled, then here's the verdict that will come down. And I see God's threat to Adam in the Eden story as a conditional verdict. He says, you can eat from all these trees. That's fine. That's great. But on the day you eat from the tree of knowledge, you will surely die. So it fits the pattern of the temple administration in the sense that it's the temple administrator, in this case, God himself, issuing an order to a temple servant and including in the order a conditional verdict about the punishment that will ensue if the servant disobeys. So I think that's another interesting connection.
You mentioned eating. You
I haven't, but
mentioned.
I haven't. There's more I can say about eating.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Go for it. Go ahead. Go ahead and get into eating.
Okay, so what about this eating thing? Yes, Adam is allowed to eat from all the other trees in the garden, and I think that word "eat" is important. It shows up in these Babylonian texts again, and it'll say things like, um, "You go take care of this orchard, and we want you to make sure all the produce from this particular set of trees goes to the temple. But you, the oblate, you can eat from this other set of trees." And typically, scholars don't actually translate that word as eat. If you look it up in a dictionary, the first definition you're going to come to is eat. But they translate it with fancy words like have the usufruct of or have the use of. And I think they are translating it correctly because what the temple is saying is you, Mr. Oblate, you can have the use of these other trees over here. And by use, they mean you can use some of the branches if you need to make a basket for yourself. Um, you can actually use parts of the tree to build certain kinds of fences. They were used in different types of construction of buildings as well. But you can also eat the fruit. So it's more than just eat, it's really have the use of the tree to a certain extent. You can't cut the tree down, you can't stop it from growing. So the one text I'm thinking of in particular tells an oblate, um, we want you to plant some new trees. You can grow a garden there with the trees, and you can eat from the new trees. You can eat from the garden. But the 12 adult trees that are already there in the orchard, you cannot eat from those. All the fruit from those trees has to go to the temple. So, really, it's saying you can eat from all these other trees, eat meaning have the use of, but you can't eat from these special trees. They're special just because they're already grown, producing fruit, and the temple wants all of that for itself. So, of course, I think of the Adam and Eve story. And when God or Yahweh says to Adam, you can eat from all these other trees, bells were ringing in my head. And I think that means you can have the use of these other trees. But you can't have the use of or eat from the tree of knowledge. That's special. That belongs to Yahweh and his assembly of divine beings, I would say. That's reserved for the higher ups. That's reserved for um, the temple administrators. And the reason I'm referring to Yahweh and his divine assembly is because later in the story, he says, the man has become like one of us in the plural. And so I think we have to imagine Yahweh as the God who's there, but he has these other beings. You can call them angels or other divine beings, whatever. I don't really care what term people assign to them, but they're non-human beings. They're of the divine world. They're servants of Yahweh, um, and the special trees are reserved for them. And Adam, as a temple servant, is not supposed to have any access to them whatsoever. He's not supposed to eat from them. And I think later in the story, when Eve says, "Oh, but we're not even supposed to touch them," I think she's really telling the truth. Um, or what she says is in keeping with what I know about these temple servants from Babylonia. They're not supposed to touch sacred items. They're not supposed to enter certain sacred spaces. Um, they're not supposed to be involved in um, the things that only the priests are to be involved in. So I think she's explaining to the snake there a fuller understanding of what it means not to eat from these special trees. Leave them alone. Um, now it doesn't. There's not an exact match with what I was describing earlier with the oblate, the one oblate in this garden who can't eat from 12 certain trees. He is supposed to take the fruit from those trees and touch the fruit and make sure it gets delivered to the temple. Um, but there are other texts that talk about oblates not being allowed to touch sacred implements or vessels, and they're definitely not supposed to touch the food after it's been prepared and consecrated and about to be delivered to the gods. That food they can't touch at all. So I don't think she's mischaracterizing what Yahweh had said earlier.
Yeah, you definitely see that. It's definitely, yeah, definitely that makes a lot of sense as far as being a sacred object and her not saying touch it. That's really fascinating because, a lot of people say like, oh, Eve got the command wrong.
Mhm.
But no, that's really fascinating to think about there. Okay. So something that I was hoping you'd talk about in regards to punishment for eating. Um, there's three texts that mention death, and
Mhm.
one and maybe two of them aren't very helpful here, but there's a third one that's really interesting. Could you talk about
Yeah, that I
whatever you
think
want
that's
to do
the
there?
text. I think that's the text I mentioned earlier, where they're not supposed to rent things to sharecroppers. That's one text that mentions death. Another one is broken in all the most interesting places, and we can't read all of it, but it's about some kind of riot, I think, that was taking place in the city of Uruk, where one of these main temples is, and certain people had to be guarded, and they might end up getting put to death. And then the third one is directed at some of these temple priests I talked about. And it says that if they go work at another temple and they don't confine their work to the temple in the city of Uruk, then they will be considered to have broken their oath of loyalty to the king. And if you break your oath of loyalty to the king, there's a good chance you'll be put to death for that. So the temple authorities are sort of raising the stakes here and saying, um, we need you guys here at our temple, nowhere else, because we actually know these guys moonlighted on the side and would go do work for other temples when they could. Um, so they're saying, no, all your work needs to happen here at our temple. Um, and if you go work for another temple, we're going to take that very, very seriously. So the temple would issue these death threats occasionally, it seems. In one case to oblates about renting out to sharecroppers, in one case to priests about working at other temples. Um, but there's plenty of evidence to show that these temple authorities could change the punishment if they saw fit. So remember, I called these conditional verdicts, and that's exactly what they are. They're conditional on various things. They're conditional, A, on whether or not the person disobeys who's being given the order. And I think they're conditional on the circumstances involved in the disobedience. So the temple might say, we're going to fine you 30 shekels of silver, or we're going to put you to death if you disobey. But in the case of actual disobedience, the temple can change its mind and issue some other punishment. Um, and I think that's what's going on in the Eden story. God says, if you eat from the tree of knowledge, you will die. They eat from the tree of knowledge. But as I read the story, they actually don't die. And a different sort of punishment is placed on them, such as pain in childbirth of the woman, and difficulty in getting crops to grow for the man. So I think um, I don't think that Yahweh is lying or is just wrong about death. It's part of how temple authorities dealt with their servants. If they wanted them to take something super seriously, they might issue a death threat, but they could always change their minds. And I say change their minds, but it's really, they could always impose a penalty that they thought was more appropriate than the one they had initially included in the conditional verdict.
Uh, when we're talking about like Old Testament law, um, there's a lot of scholars that are talking about how they weren't necessarily like a specific set of rules to be used in like court situations. It was more of a kind of like a guidelines for like this punishment that would be a good one, but it doesn't have to be that kind of thing. And it seems like a little bit of a similarity here as well with
hmm
Babylon. Do you see that similarity, and do you think that has any relation there?
I do, and I don't think you got that connection from me from reading any of my stuff. Anyway, I think that's a very excellent observation, because I do think there's a definite connection here. And as I read biblical law, I see it in much that same way. I think these rules were important and they embody or are emblematic of what covenant loyalty to Yahweh is supposed to look like. But when it comes to the punishments and the laws, I would I would see those as the harshest penalty allowed by law or the fullest extent of the law. So we might say, if you do such and such today, you get up to 20 years in prison. But there are always negotiations that go on. You might reach a plea agreement. The judge might sentence you to something less. And for much of biblical law, I think this is what's going on. I think this is the case with other ancient Eastern law codes as well. The punishments listed tend to be the harshest punishments allowed by that particular legal system. Now, when you get into certain priestly texts, like Numbers 35, you'll see things like, in the case of intentional homicide, you're not allowed to accept a ransom payment in lieu of the death penalty. You really do have to put the person to death. And I think um, in that case, they're reacting to this standard tradition of allowing people to negotiate a lesser punishment in some fashion. And they're trying to say, um, in these very serious cases, like intentional homicide, you really need to follow through with the death penalty and not allow some lesser punishment. But generally speaking, um, I would agree with your observation, or I mean, I don't know if this is your opinion, but anyway, I would agree with what you described and say, um, again, I think it's the fullest extent of the law. And I think, yeah, that understanding fills in some of the background for the conditional verdict in the Eden story, where the conditional verdict tells you what the fullest extent of the law is, but the authority, in this case Yahweh, can differ or diverge from that in the end.
Wow, that is extremely fascinating. Okay, backtracking a little bit, you
hmm
mentioned how, he kind of, God might have changed his judgment a little bit. Not his judgment, but his, I guess, punishment, kind
hmm
of. You clarified that. But, um, I mean, if, I've heard a lot of people, and I think it's somewhat convincing, at least in my opinion, it is, you know, if the garden is some type of sacred space, when these Adam and Eve they take from the fruit and they eat, um, you know they're kicked out because they can't be in that sacred space anymore because I guess they're not sacred or they're defiled in some way or something like that. But it seems like you're not taking that view and you're saying that the punishment is like it was a direct punishment. And in addition to that, I've heard a lot of people say that that list of like punishments of like childbirth kind of thing, and there's obviously
Hmm.
translation issues there, and um, with the toil of the ground, and that's like a natural consequence of them leaving the garden because they don't have this great garden to work with anymore. They're outside the garden where it's
Hmm.
all nice. So I know that's a lot to say. So maybe I can clarify. I mean, do you think that view has any evidence for that way? Does that contradict or go well with your view of like punishment, but not really punishment? Or
Hmm.
I don't know. Can you clarify?
Yeah, a couple things to say there. Right now, I have to sort of waffle on why they get kicked out of the garden. This is a fascinating question to me, and I'm open to different answers. In verse 22, I think it is, Yahweh says, behold, the man has become like one of us. What if he should reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever? Then the very next verse says, and Yahweh expelled the man from the garden. So it sounds to me as if part of the reason Yahweh kicks them out of the garden is to keep them from getting access to the tree of life. Is that the only reason he kicks them out? I don't know. I mean, maybe you're right that they're getting kicked out leads to some of these other punishments. I think the best one of the best arguments for that is the man having to work hard to grow crops out of the ground. It uses the term adamah, which is the kind of ground you find outside of the garden or outside of orchards. That's regular ground that you have to work hard, plow, and work hard to get crops to grow out of. Um, so that's a definite possibility. This other point about them being sacred and having to be kicked out because they're not sacred anymore. I don't know if you're getting that from Catherine McDowell's work, which I like a lot actually. Um, but Catherine McDowell has this book called "The Image of God in the Garden of Eden," and it's a fascinating book. And she has a lot of very interesting points and compares how Adam and Eve are created to how certain divine images are created in the ancient world. And where she and I differ, I think, um, is what happens at the end. So I think she says something like, once the man has eaten the fruit and his eyes are opened, he's now he's now defective from what he was supposed to be. He was supposed to end up being, um, kind of supposed to be in the image of God without this defect of sin and disobedience and whatever else has resulted from his eating the fruit. So he's now kind of a defective image, and he has to be kicked out of this sacred space. And I think after he eats the fruit and his eyes are opened, he's become too close. He's had his intellectual and maybe ontological status raised up with this new knowledge that he has, and now he's much too close to the status of divine. Um, she says he's uh, too defective, and I would say he's not defective enough. He's too close to the status of divine, and now he has to be kicked out. So um, it's tricky. I don't know really who has the better argument at this point, but I think there is something to this idea that they have to be prevented from the tree of life. That's part of why they get kicked out. Um, the ground being cursed, does that relate to their being kicked out? Um, I'm still working on how to fit that into my understanding of the story, but um, yeah, that's my response. I don't know. Did that cover the different things you were looking for?
Yeah, sure. Yes, for sure. A thousand different questions now.
Hmm.
So in addition, a lot of people see, oh, dust is often a word for death, and specifically Job. And I'm curious. And that's obviously what Adam's made of. Some people think that he was mortal because of it.
Hmm.
Um, it says at the end, "Dust you are, and dust you shall return," which uh, seems to be possibly a punishment, but also could be a natural outcome of leaving the garden. Some people think that means like, oh, he's gonna die because he ate from the fruit.
Hmm.
Um, and maybe we're jumping ahead here, but how does that work with your view of, or the possible view of, it their punishment being kicked out of the garden?
Hmm.
That,
Yeah, that's
is that seen as a punishment to you?
no, but there are lots of people who do see it as a punishment. I think Peter Machinist, who retired from Harvard recently, sees that as indicating one of the punishments. And he argues that they were immortal when they were created, and that when they ate from the fruit, they lost their immortality. I mean, it's almost like he's channeling his inner Saint Augustine when he talks about this text in some cases. Um, so I think that's verse 19. I'm just going to bring it up here for a second so I can actually refresh my memory on what it says, and to make sure I prove to myself I can remember these verse numbers. It is 19. Okay. So I'm reading from the NRSV. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. So the last part of verse 19 is the issue. And the question is, as you put it, is that defining one of the punishments? Or is it simply saying you're going to have to work hard to get food until the day you die, because we all know you were made from dust and you're going back to dust? Is it just reiterating something that was already the case? And so James Barr, a British scholar, wrote a book in 1992. I can't remember the name of it, but it's about Adam and Eve. And he argues, I follow his argument. He argues that that last part of verse 19 is just saying something that was already the case. It's not a new part of their status. It's not a new condition they have to live under. They were always going to return to dust. And it's just a poetic way of saying you're going to have to work hard for food for the rest of your life, all the way until the day you finally go back to the dust. Now, it's a difficult question to answer. It's debated. People who write on this are on one side or the other. I'm not saying everybody's on my side on this. So for those people who want to read it as defining one of the punishments, they have many good scholars on their side. Um, but that's how in following James Barr, that's how I understand that part of verse 19.
Gotcha. Okay. So we kind of got there really well. Okay. I want to talk about your other paper where you wrote about, I guess, what this death means in the garden. So before we talk about that, could you possibly just really briefly talk about some general popular views that people take on
Oh, right. Hmm.
what this death meant when God said, like, you will die?
Hmm. So I just mentioned Peter Machinist's view, and that's when God says you will die, he's saying you're immortal now, but when you eat from the tree, you will become mortal. Death will enter the picture in that way. Um, Other scholars like Ellen Robbins and Mark Smith, I think, talk about a conditional immortality. They were born conditionally immortal, and at least one of those scholars will say they had access to the tree of life and that they had to eat from the tree of life periodically to renew their immortality. But as soon as they're kicked out of the garden, they've lost access to the tree of life. They won't be able to renew their immortality and they will eventually die. So the first view says they're fully immortal. They don't need to keep eating from the tree of life. The second view says they need to keep eating from the tree of life because this immortality is sort of conditional. Um, Another view I think of is that of Bernard Batto, who wrote the book Slaying the Dragon from 1992, which I think is a great book. And he says God hadn't made up his mind yet as to whether or not he would let them eat from the tree of life. So they were conditionally immortal in the sense they were kind of in a liminal state. They were in between mortality and immortality, and it was going to be up to God to decide whether they fell over and onto the mortal side or are the immortal side. But their act of disobedience cut that decision-making process short. They decided for God, in a sense, um, to become mortal. So those are some of the views that are out there. I think the first view, that of Peter Machinist and others, is perhaps the more common view among general readers of the Bible, that Adam and Eve were created with immortality, and only by virtue of eating of the fruit did they lose that. And they die. They really did die, people would say, in the sense that they lost their immortality, and that's what God meant all along. I don't agree with that, but it's certainly um, one of the views that exists not just among general readers, but among scholars and professors as well.
Yeah, it's so funny that you lay out each of those views, and each one I'm like, that's really interesting. That seems like it has some good points, and then the next one's like, oh, that also has some good points, and
Mhm.
that's just so fun to me. You mentioned one more in your paper that I found interesting. Moberly, I don't know his first name. He says that they suffer in such a way that the loss may be aptly be described as a death.
Oh, right, Walter
Um,
Moberly. Yes, he and this other, they're both he and James Barr, and they're both British scholars, went back and forth a lot, um, arguing and writing on various things about the Eden story. It's interesting if somebody has lots of time in their hands, they can go get these articles that these two men wrote, and get two very different views of the story. But yeah, Moberly says that they don't necessarily lose their immortality, but life changes drastically. Life changes from sort of a good life in the garden to a bad life outside the garden. And it's so bad, it's as if they're living a kind of death because it's so much more difficult. The contrast, maybe this is a better way to say it, the contrast between life outside the garden to life in the garden is as if they died. And I think he's followed by this, or he's followed in this view by other scholars as well. Robert Gordon, who taught at Cambridge, I think follows him. Um, so that's another reasonable view that's out there among scholars.
Awesome. And finally, in regards to views, you hinted at it and maybe even talked a lot about it. Could you give us your view specifically laid out of what this death is?
Yeah. Um, and so my view on the death isn't original with me necessarily. But I do think when God says you will die, he means a regular physical death. And this kind of language he uses, on the day you eat of it, you will die, or you will surely die. That kind of language in the Hebrew Bible almost always means physical death, regular physical death. And it can be used as a kind of judicial verdict to mean um, you will be put to death as a form of punishment by the authorities that are overseeing this particular issue, whatever it might be. Um, so when God says you will die in Eden, I think he means you will be put to death by me or one of my angelic beings. And there are various reasons for this that I go into in the article, but I think the way in which that language is used in other biblical texts definitely supports my view. Um, the other thing to say is the author of the story strongly implies that there are two main features of divinity in the story. Knowledge is one, and immortality is the other. And these two qualities of divinity are represented by the two trees, the tree of knowledge and the tree of life. And when they eat from the tree of knowledge, Yahweh says, the man has become like one of us. He doesn't say the man is one of us. He just says the man has become like one of us, meaning the man has gone from not possessing either of those two qualities of divinity to now possessing one of them. He's 50% of the way there. And again, this is part of the reason I think Yahweh expels them from the garden, is to prevent the man and the woman from gaining full divinity by eating from the tree of life and acquiring immortality. So, if you think of these two characteristics, knowledge and immortality, as characterizing God and the other divine beings in that story, then I think you have to think of death as physical death in contrast to um, everlasting life, which is represented by the tree of life. Um, there was something else to go with that. Um, it has slipped my mind, so I'll just leave it there for now.
We can get back to it if you want to. All right. So, something that we basically kind of skipped over was this this knowledge. What does the knowledge of good and evil, like what does that even mean? And
Mhm.
specifically, you mentioned in your papers that there is a Babylonian context of some type of related knowledge or something like that. Could you talk about that?
Mhm. Yeah, scholars have debated this question a lot, as you know. A recent book has come out by Nathan French, I think, on what this knowledge might be. It's based on his PhD dissertation. I can't remember what he says now. Something about how this knowledge has to do with the ability to. Mm, I'm going to mess it up. I don't want to mess it up. The ability to hand out, administer good and evil. Something about administering something. I shouldn't even try. Nathan, if you're watching this, I'm sorry. Forgive me. Um, okay, so what is this knowledge? The knowledge of good and bad or evil is mentioned other places in the Bible. It's mentioned in this famous text from Isaiah 7. It says, the young woman will conceive and bear a child, and you shall call his name Emmanuel. Then it says, before the child knows how to reject the evil and choose the good, the two kings whom you dread will um, have to go back, and their lands will be captured and abandoned. In other words, you're going to be safe. You don't have to worry about these kings anymore who are about to attack you. So it sounds like it's referring to a little kid who is able to grow up a little bit at some point and is able to tell the difference at that point between good and evil. There's another text where an older person, I think one of the craftsmen who worked in the temple, no, or an advisor of David, one of those two, says he's so old now he's not able to tell the difference between good and evil. So all of these things can be used to interpret what the Eden story means. Of course, I'm stuck on this theme of the Babylonian temples, and in the Babylonian temples, there were certain recitations they did during certain rituals, and these recitations were, the text of the recitation was contained on tablets that they had, and they would read from these tablets so they could recite the proper words that go with the ritual. And we have this one text that tells one of the priests that he's going to be in trouble if he allows a temple oblate access to these texts. Now, we're not sure if they're telling him you'll be in trouble if you allow the oblates to look at the texts. You'll be in trouble if you teach the oblates how to read the texts. You'll be in trouble if you let the oblates touch the text. You'll be in trouble if you let the oblates actually speak these words out loud. I think it means you'll be in trouble if you allow the oblates to read aloud from the texts. So you'd probably have to teach the oblates how to read in the first place, and then give them these tablets so that they could have access to this knowledge that they're not supposed to have knowledge of, that they're not supposed to have access to. So these are special texts that contain special knowledge, special words that have power. And these words are reserved for the priests this knowledge is reserved for the higher ups in the temple administration. So it just makes me think that maybe there's a parallel here to knowledge in the Garden of Eden. This is knowledge that's reserved for the higher ups at Eden, and those higher ups are Yahweh and his divine assembly. So Adam and Eve, as temple servants or oblates, are not allowed access to that. Now, there are oblates among the Babylonian temples that are rebellious. Like I said, some of them run away. Some of them take things they're not supposed to. Some of them try to gain access to things they're not supposed to gain access to. So the fact that there might be rebellious oblates or oblates who we might say get too big for their britches or try to usurp privileges and prerogatives that are reserved for the higher ups, that's not unknown at all among the Babylonian temples. And it could be that the author is suggesting Adam and Eve are acting like these rebellious oblates and trying to raise their own status. And what they do is they usurp for themselves something that's reserved for Yahweh and his divine assembly that they're not supposed to have access to. And this eating of the fruit, this usurpation of these divine privileges, gives them a different status, puts them in a different category, and now they're dangerous and they have to be dealt with.
Very, very fascinating. I like the parallels there with, how Irenaeus saw Adam and Eve as, he specifically used the word childish as like immature type of thing. It's really interesting and
Oh, I didn't know that.
yeah.
Irenaeus does that. Okay.
Yeah, he's a really interesting view. So um let's see. Yeah, so why do you think God prohibited Adam and Eve from eating this tree of knowledge of good and evil?
Okay, so I just referred to the book by Nathan French. He asks that question. I think I'm going to end up disagreeing with Nathan. I have to go back and check out what he says. But for those of you who want a better answer or a different answer from what I'm going to give, check out Nathan French's book, the title of which I can't remember now either. Anyway, why does God prohibit them from eating the tree of knowledge? I don't have a good answer for that. And Nathan French would tell me I don't have a good answer for that either. I think part of it is the author can't tell the story in any other way. At some point, the author has to have them getting knowledge because the author has to have humans become differentiated from animals. And what differentiates humans from animals is our knowledge. So in Psalm 8, it says, "You made man a little lower than the angels, a little lower than these divine beings." And in that worldview, humans are a little lower because they don't have access to immortality. But they're not like the animals because the animals don't have knowledge. The animals run around naked and don't realize it. Whereas the humans, as soon as they ate from the tree of knowledge, realized that they were naked. Um, so in the setting of the story, God prohibits them from the tree of knowledge because that's reserved for the divine beings and the higher ups within the sacred estate we call Eden. But the author is also not just telling that story, he's also giving a kind of treatise on the human condition. And he has to end the story with the humans having the condition that we know humans have. So he has to get them out of the garden and onto the Adamah, the regular ground, and he has to get them out of the garden with knowledge as part of their constitution now. So if you understand that sort of going in, you kind of know they're going to end up eating from the tree and they're going to get kicked out. So it's an artfully told story, I think, to comment in some ways on the human condition. And the human condition, I think the author is saying, is one that is stuck in between sort of a divine side of us and an animal side of us. And this author hardly knew how right he was, I think, because he's basically saying humans have knowledge like the gods now. But he didn't realize we would be sending people to the moon or spaceships to Mars, or little golf cart sized objects that can knock asteroids off their trajectory. He didn't know we would have smartphones, and fiber optic cables that would allow us to communicate from one side of the world to the other by almost the speed of light. Um, if he knew that at the time, he would have, I don't know, danced a jig or something, because of how right he was in terms of the knowledge we have almost seems like the knowledge of the gods. But we're stuck in at least two ways. We're stuck working hard to get our food, and we're stuck knowing that we're going to die. Um, and this is the human condition. This knowledge uh, that in the end kind of doesn't really do us any good. It doesn't save us from returning back to dust. All this great knowledge we have um, will fail in our efforts to gain immortality. But it does something for us in a sense. So I can't really say why God prohibits Adam and Eve from the tree of knowledge, except in the way I just did, which doesn't really say why. It just says why I think the author set things up the way he did.
Really interesting. Okay. That is not an answer I expected, and I already read your work in advance.
Okay.
So, very last question here. Um, but before we do that, I wanted to give everyone an opportunity to know, is there anywhere where we can check out your work, or you have a book coming out eventually, right? That I will definitely be buying.
Yeah, I'm supposed to be working on it as we speak. It's about half done, the book on Adam and Eve. So I'm not on any social media to speak of, but the one quote unquote social media site that academics use is called academia.edu. And if you go to academia.edu and look me up, you can find my work there. You can also find a little something about me at the University of Texas website. And my wife is on Facebook. You could probably she shares my same last name. And I'm sure there are pictures of me on her Facebook page, which I haven't seen in years. But that's, yeah, I don't tweet or blog, unfortunately. But that's where people can find me, academia.edu or the University of Texas website.
Yeah, so if you guys want to look at probably old pictures of Dr. Wells, you can hit up, his wife. Just kidding. Definitely don't do that.
No, she won't.
Um,
She won't mind, actually. I mean, if people visit, or I don't even know how Facebook's work. It's like, if you're not a friend, can you leave a comment on something she posts? I don't know.
yeah, it we'll have that'll be an interview for another day.
I
Uh,
will say, Zach, if people, I'm happy to answer emails. I answer every email that gets sent to me. Um, and I don't get that many from people who are outside of the academic world. So it's always interesting to get emails from people. You can find my address on the UT website. Um, it's long and complicated, kind of, because of the way University of Texas does things. But if you go there, search for me, go to the UT website, my email address is there, and I'm always happy to get emails from people and connect that way.
that is so awesome. All right, okay, here it is. Last question. All right, the moment of truth. You've mentioned a lot of this before, but uh, you know, tying all this together, what do you think that this Babylonian context tells us about the Adam and Eve story?
Hmm. What's the cash value, the takeaway? That's a tough one. I'm still wrestling with that. There will be a chapter in the book that deals with that. It'll be chapter 6. The first 5 chapters are going to be much easier to write. Chapter 6 will be hard. So I'm going to go back to this idea that the story is a kind of treatise on the human condition. And part of the way it helps us is that it tells us how dangerous we are. So traditionally, it's read as how sin enters the world, and I don't necessarily mind that. That's not the direction I'm going in necessarily. But after they acquire this knowledge in the world of the story, they are extremely dangerous creatures now. The very next story has murder entering the picture, where Cain kills Abel. Um, and then Cain goes off, and things get worse and worse. One of Cain's descendants, Lamech, brags about how severely he has punished someone for injuring him. So retaliation and retribution kind of goes off the charts. Um, Eventually, this leads up to the flood story, where the world is engulfed in violence and mayhem. Um, if Adam and Eve had stayed in the garden, they wouldn't have knowledge, and um, I think that means they would have been very childlike, as Irenaeus apparently says. They would have been animal-like in a way in terms of their childishness. They would have run around naked and not realized it. And in the ancient Near East, humans knew enough to put clothes on. So when they eat from the knowledge, um, when they eat from the tree of knowledge, they become dangerous in the sense that they now know how to go out and do bad things. They not only have kind of the physical ability, but they have the mental capabilities to make it so much worse. Like, I have two cats, and people joke around and saying, um, if the cats were bigger, they would just eat you or something. Because cats, can sometimes be mean, do their own thing. I don't know if that's a great example. What I'm trying to say is, um, animals are big and strong, and if only they had the mental capabilities, um, they could take over the world. So, like, is it Planet of the Apes or The Rise? I don't know what that movie is. Um, do you know what I'm talking about, Zach?
Yeah, sure. There's like 17 different titles though. You got like two of
Okay.
them.
I mean, if those animals, gorillas or apes, had the mental capabilities we did, they're so much bigger and so much stronger. They could take over the world. We don't have that kind of physical strength, but we have the mental capabilities to do things like have world wars where millions of people die, create nuclear weapons um, that could destroy the world, have war after war after war. Despite our lack of physical strength, we have this kind of knowledge that makes us super, super dangerous. Not just super dangerous, but also potentially helpful. We can create medicines and build medical devices that save people's lives and extend people's life expectancy. Um, so the author is trying to say the human condition is is complex, with the potential for extreme good and the potential for extreme bad. And the way he gets there is to have us acquire what he depicts as the knowledge of the gods, this kind of divine knowledge. And that puts us in a category or gives us a certain kind of status where we can now do things like murder and commit sin. So I don't think it's totally erroneous to say that at the end of the story, sin has entered the picture, because it really has, but in a slightly different. I'm trying to describe it in a way that's different from how it's been traditionally described. And maybe my way is not better. My way is just different. But that's how I would come at that issue. Now, that's not necessarily a corollary from using the Babylonian text to reconstruct the background of the story. I think the Babylonian texts help us make sense of things like why was eating from a tree such a bad thing? Well, you're usurping the prerogatives of the temple higher ups, and we see this. We see Babylonian oblates trying to do that in Babylonia. Um, it makes sense of Adam working and guarding the garden. It makes sense of Eve saying we can't touch it, things like that. But in the end, the takeaway I think is still about the human condition, um, and whether or not the Babylonian texts help shed new light on that particular question um, will be up for debate even after the book is done, I'm sure.
Awesome. All right. So I'm gonna be completely honest. I zoned out for like 2 seconds, and I think I missed one of the most exciting things you said about sin. Could you? Really sorry. Could
That's
you
okay.
repeat the part about sin that you were saying was not how it's usually seen?
Yeah,
Could you repeat that for me?
sure. So at the end of the story, the humans have this condition where they have knowledge which allows them to go out and do really bad things. Before they have that knowledge, I don't think they know how to do the kind of terrible things humans end up doing. Um, so what I'm trying to say is, uh, at the end of the story, sin does enter the picture, but I'm saying it comes in sort of differently. The knowledge is what's necessary to make us dangerous in the way that we really are dangerous. If they had stayed in the garden and had never eaten, they wouldn't be as dangerous. They wouldn't be as knowledgeable either. So I don't think their initial status in the garden was this status of perfection because they're lacking knowledge. That's a big deal that they don't have that knowledge. They're childlike and animal like. But when they gain the knowledge, according to the author of the story, they turn into a different kind of creature who can wreak havoc in the world. And so you have the murder of Cain and Abel, you have the violence before the flood. And in our own day and age, you have terrible wars that kill way too many people. Um, so I'm trying to say, um, eating from the tree of knowledge creates the condition uh, for human sinful action. It it was the missing component to the human condition for sinful action. So as soon as they get that knowledge, it, I'm trying not to say this, but I'm going to go ahead and say it. As soon as they get that knowledge, they become sinners. Because not because they ate from the tree necessarily, but because now they possess all the things they need to be really bad people.
That is incredibly interesting, but that also fits into the city and the instruments and the weapons, and it's like advancement, but it's not terribly seen as bad, but it's the possibility to do bad, and that's so fascinating. Wow.